A radar blip flickered on for less than 3 seconds, then vanished. Somewhere above the icy expanse of the Barents Sea, a Soviet MiG-23 pilot peered through his aging CRT scope, scanning for the contact that ground control insisted was out there. The radar panned again. Nothing. Wind howled outside his cockpit. Snow misted his canopy. Still nothing. Then, from the west, a shimmer. A flash. A shadow too fast to track. Before he could react, 2 AM-7 Sparrow missiles streaked out of the clouds. No lock warning, no evasive orders, just a blink of flame and impact. The MiG disintegrated into falling steel and fire. Behind it all, the source of the kill never came into view. A U.S. Navy F-18 Hornet banked away silently, climbing into the overcast, disappearing into cloud layers like a phantom. The MiG pilot never saw the jet that killed him. This wasn't an isolated incident. From the Mediterranean to the Sea of Japan, from the Gulf of Oman to the Baltic air corridors, it kept happening. MiG-21s, MiG-23s, even the prized MiG-29s, aircraft crafted by Soviet engineers to dominate dogfights, were being outmatched by something they didn't expect. A smaller naval multirole aircraft with a modest silhouette and a reputation that didn't match its kill ratio. The F-18 Hornet was never supposed to be the star of American air power. It was introduced as a carrier-based compromise. Part fighter, part bomber, designed to replace both the F-4 Phantom and the A-7 Corsair. Soviet intelligence classified it as a mid-tier strike aircraft, optimized for short-range carrier operations with limited agility and average sensor power. But in the real world, that theory fell apart. Over and over, Hornets not only held their own, they dominated. They jammed radar networks, they ghosted through intercept zones, they locked and fired before MiGs even realized a fight had started. In exercises and live patrols alike, Hornet pilots controlled the tempo, manipulated range, and leveraged electronic warfare with lethal precision. To Soviet planners, this was impossible. The Hornet wasn't supposed to outperform high-speed interceptors. It wasn't supposed to outfly MiGs in a turning fight. It wasn't supposed to survive in contested airspace alone. And yet it did. The answer wasn't in thrust or altitude or weapon load. It was in something the Soviet Union had long underestimated: sensor fusion, pilot interface, and combat autonomy. The F-18 Hornet wasn't just an aircraft. It was the world's first fully networked fighter. And in a sky filled with blind MiGs, it saw everything. This is the story of the jet the Soviets never understood. The warplane that turned naval doctrine into an airborne ambush. The one that changed air combat not by brute force, but by outthinking every adversary it ever faced. In a concrete basement beneath the Ministry of Defense in Moscow, Soviet air analysts sat hunched over projection slides and intercept telemetry. The year was 1985. On the wall, a blurry image of the F-18 Hornet, its twin tails, compact wingspan, and underwing stores, flickered under dim fluorescent light. The room was quiet, filled with the quiet hum of outdated air conditioning and the scrape of pencils against notepads. The conclusion was unanimous. The Hornet was not a threat. To the Soviet Union's aerospace establishment, the F-18 was a budget aircraft, a jack-of-all-trades designed to operate from cramped U.S. Navy carriers meant to replace aging fleet assets. It had less range than an F-14 Tomcat, carried fewer missiles than an F-15 Eagle, and lacked the raw climb rate of the MiG-29. On paper, it was a compromise. And in the eyes of Soviet planners, compromise meant weakness. They measured the Hornet the way they measured all NATO assets, by speed, altitude ceiling, thrust to weight, and maximum payload. In every metric, it seemed inferior to the cutting-edge MiG fighters rolling out of factories in Gorky and Novosibirsk. The MiG-29 had blistering acceleration and could turn tighter than any U.S. jet. The MiG-23 had higher top speed. Even the older Su-15 had a better vertical climb profile. So when Hornets first appeared in patrol formations over the Mediterranean and off the coast of Kamchatka, the Soviet Air Force logged them without urgency. Interceptors scrambled. Pilots were briefed. They were told the aircraft had limited radar capability, that it required support from AWACS to be effective, that it posed little danger in a stand-up engagement. And yet, one by one, those assumptions unraveled. In 1987, a MiG-23 pilot attempted to close with a lone Hornet off the coast of Crete. What began as a routine intercept turned chaotic. The Hornet didn't break away. It jammed the MiG's radar, dropped to sea level, looped behind, and painted a missile lock. The MiG broke off, rattled and confused. The tapes were reviewed in Moscow. Soviet radar technicians insisted the Hornet's electronic warfare capability had been overstated. MiG engineers blamed pilot error. No one wanted to consider the possibility that the F-18 was something more than its specifications. The truth was harder to quantify. The Hornet wasn't just a set of numbers. It was a machine built around decision-making. Its cockpit layout fused radar, targeting, and countermeasures into a single control interface. Its fly-by-wire system gave pilots confidence to push maneuvers to the edge. Its onboard computers took raw data and fed it as situational awareness, not noise, not clutter, clarity. But none of that appeared on Soviet spreadsheets. The F-18's greatest advantage didn't show up in performance charts. It wasn't the engine. It wasn't the airframe. It was what happened when the radar lit up, and the Hornet pilot saw more, earlier and clearer, while the MiG pilot stared into static. And in the room of wrong assumptions, no one could model that. By the late 1970s, Soviet air doctrine was locked into a playbook forged by decades of high-speed warfare assumptions. Speed wins. Altitude kills. Mass overwhelms. From the earliest MiG-15s that dogfought Sabres over Korea to the Mach 2 MiG-25s stalking SR-71s at the edge of space, Soviet aerospace design focused on velocity, climb rate, and brute force engagements. Air combat was envisioned as a vertical chess match. Radar locks, missile launches, hard brakes, and mutual destruction at supersonic speeds. But by 1980, something was shifting. At NATO's elite red flag exercises and Top Gun trials, pilots weren't winning with raw performance anymore. They were winning with data, fusion, and tactical autonomy. And nowhere was that shift more pronounced than in the emerging doctrine surrounding the F-18 Hornet. The U.S. Navy's approach was changing. The days of having a fighter pilot juggle separate radar, countermeasure switches, weapon select toggles, and threat displays were ending. The Hornet integrated them all. The pilot didn't interpret 6 systems. He read 1. That changed everything. Suddenly, the battle wasn't about who could climb faster. It was about who could see and strike first. The Hornet was optimized not for sheer acceleration, but for tactical flexibility. Its advanced APG-65 radar tracked multiple targets at once and could lock onto low-flying, high-speed threats, even in cluttered terrain. Its onboard electronic warfare suite didn't just defend, it blinded enemies, and its computer-driven fly-by-wire system allowed pilots to fly aggressive post-stall maneuvers with confidence, often pushing the envelope well past what Soviet pilots thought was survivable. Meanwhile, Soviet MiG doctrine was still based on a command-driven hierarchy. Ground-controlled intercepts dictated positioning. Centralized radar sites handed off targets. Pilots were trained to follow vector commands and engage at prescribed angles, speeds, and altitudes. There was little room for improvisation. But in the air, improvisation was survival. The Hornet's doctrine encouraged pilots to adapt dynamically. If jamming occurred, Hornets could maneuver independently using onboard targeting. If missile locks failed, they could slip under radar, pop up, and re-engage using terrain-masked approaches. In naval strike missions, they operated in pairs, trading sensor data and alternating attack roles without needing carrier command approval. This new doctrine wasn't theoretical. In NATO exercises, Hornets routinely outscored older F-4s and even early model F-15s in dogfight kill ratios. Against MiG-21s and MiG-23 stand-ins flown by aggressor pilots, they achieved simulated 8:1 and 10.1 kill ratios, leveraging not just maneuverability, but complete battle space awareness. Soviet war planners noticed. Their recon satellites picked up new maneuver patterns during U.S. carrier drills. Their radio intercepts heard fewer command handoffs, more autonomous call signs, and when they reviewed the footage of Hornets dropping laser-guided bombs and engaging fighters within the same sortie, they were forced to admit this wasn't just a strike fighter. It was something new. The F-18 wasn't built to match the MiG-29. It was built to outclass it in a battlefield the MiG couldn't fully enter. A battlefield shaped by information, integration, and independence. And Soviet doctrine, for all its hardware and heritage, was not ready. The sun was setting low over the Mediterranean in July 1986. A pair of U.S. Navy F-18 Hornets lifted off from the deck of the USS Coral Sea, climbing into a warm orange sky on a routine combat air patrol. Somewhere to the east, Soviet-built MiG-23 floggers launched from a Syrian airfield, 4 of them, flying in tactical wedge formation. Their mission? Intercept and identify. They never got close. From hundreds of miles away, E-2 Hawkeye surveillance aircraft tagged the MiGs and relayed their vector to the Hornets. But here was the first shock. The F-18s didn't wait for further orders. They plotted their own intercept course, adjusted for terrain masking, and descended into a low-altitude approach using nothing but onboard radar and electronic countermeasure systems. By the time the MiGs reached radar range, the Hornets were already in position, hidden just above sea level, with missile tone ready. At 40 nautical miles, the lead Hornet launched 2 AIM-7 Sparrow missiles using track-while-scan radar mode. One MiG broke sharply, trying to dive. The other attempted to jam the incoming signal. It didn't matter. Seconds later, the sky lit up with twin flashes. The first MiG was destroyed. The second evaded the missile, but exposed itself. The trailing Hornet, unseen until now, pulled vertical, locked on, and simulated a kill at close range. The remaining 2 MiGs broke into the horizon and vanished, retreating to base. The engagement lasted less than 60 seconds. No U.S. aircraft took damage. 4 Soviet-designed interceptors had been outmaneuvered, outfoxed, and electronically overwhelmed by just 2 Hornets, without even needing visual range. When NATO reviewed the engagement logs and gun camera footage, a stunned realization spread across the room. The F-18 had orchestrated the entire encounter without external command. This wasn't just a victory, it was a revelation. Everything the Soviets had planned for, ground control intercepts, radar lock chases, high-speed pursuit, meant nothing if the enemy could simply outsee and outthink you before a single missile was even visible. And for the U.S. Navy, it was a moment of doctrinal transformation. The Hornet wasn't just a stopgap platform anymore, it was now the backbone of carrier-based air dominance. In briefings to the Pentagon, Naval Intelligence noted that the Hornet had achieved strategic air control in a tactical frame, meaning it was now possible for small, 2-ship elements to deny airspace to larger forces, especially Soviet-aligned aircraft. But the most significant takeaway wasn't tactical. It was psychological. Soviet air planners had seen the MiG-23 as a true workhorse, fast, powerful, capable of overwhelming any American multirole fighter. Yet here, it had been hunted, tracked, jammed, killed, all before its radar could finish a full sweep. Back in the Mediterranean, the Hornets returned to the Coral Sea in radio silence. Their crews climbed down, reviewed footage, and prepared for the next sortie. No celebration, just confirmation. What had happened once could happen again. The Soviets didn't know it yet, but that evening over the sea marked the moment their doctrine started to unravel, not with explosions, but with silence, and a kill that arrived before the fight had even begun. Back in Moscow, the incident over the Mediterranean was buried deep within classified GRU intercept reports. Officially, nothing had happened. Unofficially, Soviet analysts scrambled to understand how 2 Western naval aircraft had managed to disable an entire MiG flight without visual contact. The initial response was denial. Senior officers at the General Staff dismissed the claims as exaggerated. One even remarked, "Americans win on paper more often than in the sky." To them, the F-18 was still just a second-rate fleet defender, a flying compromise built to land on a carrier, not to survive real combat. It wasn't fast enough to outchase a MiG. It wasn't agile enough to outturn one. The idea that it could jam, lock, and destroy 4 interceptors in under a minute didn't fit any known model. Instead, blame shifted to the Syrian pilots. They must have misread radar warnings. They must have panicked. Perhaps they weren't properly trained. But that explanation didn't hold for long. Within a month, the Soviets received another shock. Satellite imagery of NATO exercises in the North Atlantic showed F-18s operating independently, far beyond their expected range. Intercepts of NATO communications revealed multiple instances where Hornets launched coordinated simulated attacks without vectoring from AWACS. These aircraft weren't flying under command. They were flying as their own command. This revelation rattled Soviet planners. For decades, the assumption had been clear. U.S. aircraft relied heavily on centralized control. Remove AWACS and jamming platforms, and American fighters would be blind. But the Hornet was built differently. Its cockpit was a battlefield brain, capable of tracking, targeting, and executing decisions with minimal outside input. The pilot didn't need permission to strike. He needed only opportunity. The APG-65 radar on board the F-18 could identify targets at long range, even against sea clutter. Its onboard EW suite could detect, counter, and neutralize radar threats while maintaining weapons lock. And its ability to seamlessly integrate with other naval assets meant that even without visual contact, every Hornet knew where the enemy was, where friendly fighters were, and who was already engaging. The Soviets had no equivalent. MiG pilots still depended on ground control intercept vectors. Their cockpits required manual systems switching. Their radars often couldn't track more than a single target. In a dogfight, these shortcomings were survivable. In a modern BVR engagement? Fatal. Still, Moscow held the line. They argued that the MiG-29 would correct everything, that its superior thrust-to-weight and infrared search and track systems would neutralize the F-18's radar advantage, that Soviet pilots could adapt once they understood the threat. But even those statements were delivered with less conviction now, because for the first time, Soviet air doctrine wasn't just being challenged, it was being outpaced. Not by a superweapon. Not by a stealth fighter, but by something far more dangerous to an empire built on control, a pilot who didn't need orders to win. Inside the design bureaus of Mikoyan and Sukhoi, engineers huddled over blueprints, wind tunnel models, and telemetry reports from test flights. The Central Soviet theory of air superiority still held firm. Agility, speed, and vertical dominance would defeat any Western aircraft in a close-range dogfight. MiG-29s were being hailed as the pinnacle of this thinking. A sleek, powerful twin-engine platform with an incredible thrust-to-weight ratio, capable of sharp turns and blistering acceleration. Its IRST, infrared search and track system, was supposed to give it the edge in passive targeting. Its helmet-mounted sight allowed off-boresight missile launches. On paper, it was designed to destroy aircraft like the F-15 and F-16. As for the F-18, Soviet theory saw it as nothing more than a lightweight nuisance. Too slow to fight a MiG, one classified memo concluded. Too reliant on external control. Built for Navy logistics, not combat maneuvering. The prevailing belief was that if the F-18 were ever forced into a real engagement with a MiG, it would be overwhelmed by superior Soviet aerodynamics and missile reach. But theory has a cruel way of collapsing in practice. At Red Flag and Cope Thunder exercises in the mid to late 1980s, F-18 pilots weren't just holding their own. They were dominating. In scenarios designed to mimic Warsaw Pact attacks, Hornets frequently scored first kills, broke contact, and repositioned while MiG-equivalent aggressors were still searching their radar scopes. The secret: integration. The F-18 didn't rely on pilot reflexes alone. It was built around a human-machine interface. The radar, countermeasures, navigation, and weapons systems weren't spread across a dozen switches and dials. They were layered into a glass cockpit with a centralized information display. A single glance gave the pilot everything: threat bearings, missile readiness, jamming sources, terrain overlays. Meanwhile, the MiG-29 cockpit remained a relic, cluttered, analog, requiring high pilot workload. Switching from radar to IRST meant breaking concentration. Launching a missile required multiple steps, each prone to error under stress. Soviet planners never saw it coming. The real dogfight wasn't in the sky. It was in information speed. And there, the F-18 operated in another dimension. It could track multiple targets, assign priorities, simulate engagements, and execute split-second changes based on cockpit data. Even when locked up by a MiG, the Hornet's pilot often had better situational awareness, knowing where every other aircraft was, including threats beyond visual range. The final blow to the Soviet theory came in 1988, during NATO's annual electronic warfare trials. F-18s consistently defeated electronic jamming that blinded other aircraft. They could engage in terrain-following attack runs and surface suppression missions while maintaining air-to-air dominance. In one simulation, a two-ship Hornet flight eliminated an entire Red Force flight, including a MiG-29 pair, before ever appearing on radar. Soviet pilots, reviewing the mock telemetry, were baffled. They weren't just being outflown, they were being outthought. And no amount of thrust or angle of attack could fix that. Even as cockpit integration and radar fusion gave the F-18 an edge in individual engagements, the Soviet High Command clung tightly to one final advantage: ground control. From the beginning of the Cold War, Soviet air doctrine leaned heavily on ground-controlled intercept, GCI. The idea was simple. Fighters didn't need full autonomy if they were constantly guided by high-power land-based radar stations. These stations, connected by hardened communication lines, would direct pilots to targets, provide altitude and heading vectors, and coordinate intercepts with precision timing. The pilot was a weapon, not a tactician. In theory, this system was elegant. Soviet interceptors were fast, their missiles long-range, and their radar guidance provided by massive, fixed-position systems stretching across Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. But this theory had a fatal flaw. It assumed the battlefield would be static. It assumed control would remain unbroken. Enter the F-18 Hornet. Built from the ground up to operate in contested and degraded environments, the Hornet didn't need a radar van in Poland to tell it where to go. It didn't even need an AWACS overhead. It was designed to make its own decisions in real time, based on onboard data and shared inputs from other aircraft, ships, and electronic platforms. During a 1989 NATO joint exercise over the North Sea, this flaw in Soviet doctrine was ruthlessly exposed. A simulated war scenario involved Soviet-style tactics, MiG-29 stand-ins, controlled by GCI mimicking Warsaw Pact behavior, attempted to close on a NATO carrier group. As the exercise unfolded, the defending forces' AWACS went dark, replicating a jamming or destruction scenario. On the red team, this caused confusion. Without GCI feed, their pilots struggled to vector efficiently. Missed intercept windows, overlapping approach paths, and delayed responses began to stack up. But the F-18s? They didn't miss a beat. Their radar systems maintained track continuity. Their data-linked systems allowed pilots to share targeting information in real time. A Hornet on the right flank could transmit a threat bearing to one on the left, and both would execute a pincer attack without needing a single command from above. When post-exercise review boards analyzed the data, the verdict was clear. The Red Force failed not because of aircraft limitations, but because its doctrine collapsed without ground control. The Hornet, meanwhile, had operated like a living network, each pilot acting as a node, each decision point reinforcing the kill chain. Soviet planners reading the debrief didn't want to believe it. Their entire philosophy of layered radar and ground-managed air superiority was rendered obsolete by a plane that fought like it didn't need help, because it didn't. They had assumed the advantage of GCI would keep Western pilots on the defensive. They were wrong, because the Hornet wasn't flying in the past. It was flying in the future. A future where aircraft talked to each other, adapted instantly, and never waited for orders. And against that kind of system, no amount of centralized control could save you. Throughout the Cold War, Soviet intelligence prided itself on building deep technical profiles of every Western aircraft. Each jet was charted, analyzed, and simulated. Radar cross-sections were estimated. Electronic signatures were cataloged. Doctrine predictions were modeled in sprawling files tucked inside the walls of GRU headquarters. And yet, for all that surveillance, they never understood the F-18. The early assumption was that the Hornet's radar signature would be large, like the F-4 Phantom before it. Its twin engines, twin vertical stabilizers, and external weapons were expected to light up early warning radars from dozens of kilometers away. Interceptor forces were told that the Hornet would be a visible target long before it reached missile range. But when radar operators along the Kola Peninsula began logging real-world engagements, the results were baffling. Hornets approached at low altitude and vanished below radar. When they popped up to strike, they remained trackable for just seconds, then disappeared again. Surface-to-air systems locked too late. Interceptors scrambled too slowly. By the time MiGs were airborne, the Hornets were already outbound, their strike completed. Soviet engineers reviewed the telemetry and assumed jamming. They suspected that the F-18 was using external support, possibly from E-2 Hawkeye aircraft or jamming ships. But further analysis revealed something far more unsettling. Hornets were winning electronic contests on their own. Their built-in ALQ-165 ASPJ electronic warfare suite wasn't just protecting them from incoming missiles, it was actively scrambling enemy radar inputs. Soviet intercept operators reported false blips, ghost tracks, and sudden radar blackouts, signs of sophisticated onboard deception. This meant Hornets could neutralize air defenses without needing a dedicated electronic warfare jet nearby. They were jammers, fighters, and bombers rolled into one. But even worse than the deception was the invisibility of their intentions. Soviet doctrine depended on reading enemy formations. If a Western flight took off with certain loadouts, GCI would infer its objective: combat air patrol, strike mission, recon sweep. But the Hornet shattered those assumptions. It could launch with air-to-air missiles and laser-guided bombs simultaneously. It could play defense or offense, switch roles mid-mission without rearming or redirecting. In short, Soviet intelligence couldn't categorize it. One classified GRU briefing, discovered in post-Soviet archives, referred to the Hornet as a non-compliant tactical unit. That term, meant to denote unpredictability, was a tacit admission of defeat. If you couldn't anticipate what an enemy aircraft was going to do, you couldn't build a strategy to stop it. And that failure extended into the cockpit. MiG pilots entered intercept zones expecting visual contact. But often, their first indication of enemy presence was a lock-on tone, followed seconds later by a simulated or real kill. They never saw the Hornet. They never knew its angle. It simply appeared in their HUD, already armed, already committed. This wasn't a gap in technology. It was a collapse in understanding. For decades, the Soviets had built an intelligence apparatus around the idea that knowing an aircraft's statistics could tell you how it would fight. But the F-18 didn't fight like an aircraft. It fought like a system. Invisible, connected, uncooperative. And against that, the best data in the world was just background noise. By the late 1980s, U.S. naval air power had stopped thinking in terms of individual aircraft. The old image, one pilot, one jet, one kill, was fading. In its place emerged a networked ecosystem, with the F-18 Hornet at its core. It wasn't just a warplane, it was a node in a battlefield-wide data chain, a flying terminal for the most integrated kill web the Cold War had ever seen. At sea, the Hornet's true power wasn't in thrust or payload. It was in connection. Every time an F-18 took off from a carrier like the USS Nimitz or USS Coral Sea, it wasn't just entering the sky, it was entering a data cloud. E-2C Hawkeye aircraft patrolled overhead, feeding long-range surveillance data. Aegis-equipped cruisers and destroyers processed incoming signals, triangulated threats, and silently handed off targeting solutions to inbound fighters. Even submerged submarines, tracking Soviet ships and aircraft, could route data to the carrier group. The Hornet pilot, sitting in a glass cockpit surrounded by radar feeds, threat indicators, and digital maps, didn't have to guess. He knew. He knew the MiG's heading before it showed on radar. He knew when to brake, when to climb, when to strike, based on a stream of real-time intelligence that no Soviet pilot could imagine. He wasn't reacting. He was orchestrating. This was the American system, an architecture of autonomy designed to give each pilot the tools of a squadron. With the Hornet, a two-ship element could play the role of SICUM. In multiple documented scenarios, 4 Hornets covered entire strike corridors, managing defense, offense, and suppression without needing assistance. The system even redefined how engagements unfolded. Traditional Soviet doctrine envisioned aerial combat as a linear event: detect, intercept, lock, fire, disengage. But in the U.S. Navy's world, built around the F-18, that sequence could happen out of order, or all at once. A Hornet could jam one target, track another, fire at a third, and coordinate with a fourth, without ever speaking over radio. Pilots used data-linked displays, non-verbal signals, and pre-mission software-loaded profiles to adapt in seconds. If a MiG altered its vector, the Hornet didn't just chase, it rerouted the entire battlefield. Carrier air wings evolved alongside the Hornet. Tactics manuals were rewritten. No longer did commanders assign missions to individual aircraft. Now, they defined outcomes and let the F-18 teams shape the path. One combat simulation in 1989 demonstrated this transformation clearly. A Red Force built around MiG-29s and Su-24s attempted a complex multi-vector strike on a U.S. carrier group. The Hornets, working in pairs, intercepted the attack before the MiGs reached launch range. Each Hornet element had independently adjusted its intercept angles, executed electronic suppression, and diverted the attack, without direct orders. It wasn't just aircraft versus aircraft anymore. It was system versus doctrine, and the doctrine was losing. What made this system even more terrifying to Soviet planners was its durability. You couldn't knock it offline. Even if an AWACS went down, Aegis systems could step in. If ship-based tracking failed, airborne Hornets filled the gap. Each node compensated for the next. The Hornet didn't just punch above its weight. It extended the weight of the entire U.S. military machine into any airspace it entered. Soviet analysts finally began to realize this wasn't a failure of engineering on their part. Their MiGs were fast, maneuverable, and dangerous. But they were alone. In the new air war, isolation was death, and the F-18 never fought alone. The skies over the North Cape were calm on the morning of October 3, 1989. NATO's annual Arctic Shield exercise was underway, a simulated defense of northern Europe involving warships, submarines, and dozens of aircraft. Officially, it was a drill. But for one Soviet reconnaissance squadron operating out of the Kola Peninsula, it would become an unexpected moment of reckoning. 4 MiG-29 Fulcrums were scrambled from an airfield near Murmansk. Their mission: intercept and shadow a U.S. Navy carrier strike group reportedly transiting near Norwegian waters. Their radar scopes showed nothing at first, just the endless white of sea clutter and low thermal signatures. Then a faint return. 2 contacts. Approaching fast. The MiGs accelerated, climbing to 25,000 feet, confident in their radar and IRST superiority. Their briefers had told them the Americans would be operating F-18 Tomcats. Predictable. Big. Easy to spot and track. They were wrong. What they encountered instead was a 2-ship flight of F-18 Hornets, flying low, quiet, and fast. The MiGs initiated the intercept, maneuvering for a lock. But the Hornets didn't climb. They didn't present an engagement window. Instead, they disappeared off radar, diving low and using the terrain to blind the MiGs' forward tracking systems. Within seconds, they reappeared, on the MiGs' 6 o'clock. What followed wasn't a dogfight. It was an ambush. The lead Hornet executed a high G loop from below, simulating a missile launch at the trailing MiG-29. The wingman broke hard left and painted the second MiG from the flank. Both kills were called in under 2 minutes. No American aircraft had been seen visually by the MiGs before dying. No radar locks had been achieved. No countermeasures deployed. And just as quickly as they had arrived, the Hornets vanished, dropping back to sea-skimming altitude, riding the wave tops back toward their carrier. Soviet intercept crews at Murmansk were stunned. The returning MiG pilots, some of their most experienced, were visibly shaken. "We didn't know what hit us," one later admitted in a classified debrief. "It was like chasing a ghost." News of the engagement reached NATO channels within hours. Though no weapons were fired, the exercise logs told the story. American aircraft had turned a would-be intercept into a complete reversal. 2 Hornets against 4 of the Soviet Union's best front-line fighters. The Red Air Force was humiliated. What made the outcome even more damaging was that this wasn't some stealth operation. The F-18 wasn't cloaked or undetectable. It had been seen. Too late. The Soviet pilots simply couldn't process or counter its tactics fast enough. By the time they understood what was happening, they were already virtual kills. The performance shook the foundation of Soviet air superiority assumptions. If a small U.S. Navy fighter, less famous than the F-14, less fast than the F-15, could dominate MiG-29s in open airspace, what did that say about the Soviet Air Force's true capabilities? The Arctic Shield incident became a whisper within GRU corridors, passed between commanders like a cautionary tale. Some argued it was a fluke. Others knew better. It was doctrine failure made visible, not in war, but in front of an international audience of allies and rivals. And it proved something the Soviets had refused to admit for a decade. The F-18 wasn't just capable. It was untouchable, because it wasn't playing by the old rules. It was writing new ones, one clean kill at a time. The collapse didn't come from a bomb. It came from a radar screen that stayed empty. By 1990, the Soviet military-industrial complex was buckling under the weight of economic stagnation, political uncertainty, and one disquieting truth. Its most advanced air assets had been overtaken, not just technically, but conceptually. And the F-18 Hornet was proof. In strategy rooms from Kaliningrad to Khabarovsk, the core tenets of Soviet aerial dominance, speed, centralized command, missile range, no longer held under scrutiny. Every report, every intercepted exercise, every failed mock engagement confirmed a bitter reality. NATO had leapfrogged into a new kind of warfare, one built on decentralization, pilot autonomy, and networked dominance. And the aircraft that embodied that shift wasn't the stealthy F-17 or the massive F-15. It was the modest, underestimated, compact-frame Hornet. In a world where visibility no longer guaranteed survivability, the Hornet's real strength was strategic versatility. It could deploy from a carrier or a land base. It could switch from air to ground mid-sortie. It could fly in a wing or operate solo deep behind lines, still fully lethal. To Soviet doctrine, this kind of flexibility was alien and terrifying, because flexibility meant unpredictability, and unpredictability shattered control. It wasn't just the aircraft itself that broke the model, it was what it represented. A shift away from industrial mass to digital precision, from brute force to real-time insight, from human as cog to human as node. And for the Soviet Union, built on centralized planning, layered hierarchy, and rigid combat chains, that was an existential threat. In 1991, as the USSR dissolved, Western analysts pored over declassified Soviet reports. Many expected to find focus on stealth technology, long-range missile parity, or nuclear survivability. Instead, they found an obsession with systems like the F-18. Because in it, the Soviets saw the future of war. Small, fast, self-sufficient, and invisibly connected to a kill web that couldn't be tracked, let alone jammed. They didn't fear the F-18 because it was unbeatable in a turn. They feared it because it didn't have to turn at all. It saw first. It struck first. And it left no trace but wreckage and radio silence. In the end, the F-18 didn't just destroy Soviet aircraft. It destroyed the Soviet idea of how a pilot should fight. And that was a loss no MiG or missile could recover from. Today, the F-18 Hornet continues to fly, though often eclipsed by newer platforms. Its successors, the Super Hornet, the F-35, draw headlines and headlines again. But beneath the surface of every modern fighter doctrine, every integrated battlefield strategy, the DNA of the Hornet remains. It was the first to prove that data beats raw speed, that integration beats brute force, and that one pilot, empowered by systems, could control the entire shape of a fight. In former Soviet states, aviation museums now showcase preserved MiG-23s and MiG-29s, sleek, sharp, and menacing. Yet next to them, a small photo, rarely noticed, shows a grainy silhouette of an F-18, tucked into the clouds, missile doors open, radar dish glowing faintly. A ghost. That's what the Hornet became to Soviet planners. Not a warplane, a phantom, an aircraft that shouldn't have won but did, not by defying physics, but by redefining what combat meant. It flew circles around dogma. It buried old assumptions in silence, and for those who once laughed at it, tracked it, dismissed it, the Hornet was the last sound they never heard.